Hi everyone, I'm Dana and welcome back to Inverter Always. So in today's video, we're going to be continuing the conversation on the Daikin D-checker, a diagnostic tool used with the Daikin mini splits and VRVS systems. But before we get into the runtime for today's video, a lot of stuff happened this weekend, and I'd like to share that with you here before we get started. So first of all, you guys, a huge thank you to all of my subscribers back in October when I started this channel. I gave myself a little goal. I wasn't going to cut my hair until I got to 100 subscribers. That happened on Sunday morning. Coincidentally, Sunday was also the Super Bowl, so I got a lot of stuff done on Sunday. I went ahead and I took care of business up top. It was getting a little crazy. I did enjoy my long, blonde, curly locks while they were around, but I definitely needed a haircut. So thank you guys for making that happen. It wasn't just me taking care of business on Sunday, though. The boys wanted to get involved as well. So we took care of both of their haircuts simultaneously. And little sister also was hoping to get in on that action. But unfortunately, it's going to be a little while longer before she gets to cut her hair. Now, it was also the Super Bowl. And a big congratulations to Tom Brady for getting his 7th Super Bowl victory. I think he's up to 7 now. Honestly, I've lost track. I'm not a huge fan. I don't follow Tom Brady personally. But, you know, anyone who can achieve something like that definitely deserves credit. So a big congratulations to him. More exciting news for me personally. I'm a huge fan of the Seattle Seahawks and specifically Russell Wilson. Since the day he came into the league, I've been a humongous fan of Russell, and he was awarded the Walter Payton Man of the Year. So a huge congratulations to Russell Wilson. Now, one more thing happened this weekend, and I'm very excited to let you guys know the Madoka controller I've talked about in several episodes now finally showed up, and I installed it in my garage, connected it to my wall mount unit. It's a very cool controller. There were definitely some surprising features I was not anticipating, though. So in an upcoming video here, probably next week, I'm very excited to share my experience with you guys, talk about the controller. We'll go through a few different videos on it. But before we get into any of the Madoka controller series, we need to finish up the Daikin D-checker. So in today's video, we're going to be monitoring some runtime on a VRVS system I have installed at my house. I have 2 air handlers, one for upstairs, one for downstairs, and a wall mount in my garage, man cave area. We're going to be taking a look at how my system is performing right now, go through the refrigeration loop, and hopefully just share some information with you guys that helps you learn a little bit more about the tool and a little bit more about the VRVS system. So let's jump right in. All right, you guys, so before we get started, just a couple of disclaimers and notes that I'd like to share with you before we jump into the runtime. This is not a technical class. This is not a factory certified class. This is not a training, none of that. I'm just a person on YouTube. I'm sharing my experience. I'm sharing my thoughts and my opinions with you guys and nothing more. My hope is that the information I share with you today can be useful to you next time you're in the field taking runtime, but that is it. This is not a technical class. This is not a factory authorized class or anything like that. I'm just a random person on YouTube who's talking about Daikin, talking about runtime, and nothing more. All right, so now that we have that out of the way, let's just do a quick overview on the equipment I have installed at my house, which we'll be taking runtime on today. I actually have what's called a VRV Life system installed at my house. A couple of minutes ago, I referred to it as a VRVS. They're virtually the exact same unit. The only difference between a VRV Life outdoor heat pump and a VRVS outdoor heat pump is the board. The components within are the exact same. The reason there's a different board is because I have a gas furnace with an A coil installed at my house in addition to an air handler plus my wall mount. So earlier when I said two air handlers, I should have probably just said two ducted units. One of them's technically a furnace, and anytime you have a furnace installed, you have to use the VRV Life outdoor unit because it has a board that communicates with the furnace. If you install the VRVS, and the board that's inside that VRVS, it doesn't actually have the gas furnace indoor unit in its programming, so it won't communicate properly. Other than that, they're the same system. Okay, so the goal today is going to be going through the loop, just like we did in the last video when we talked about the mini split systems and looking at the runtime and how the runtime should look. We're going to do the exact same thing today, but you're going to find on a VRVS system, there are more components to look at. And if you watched our video from last week where we talked about the mini splits and the multi-split systems, we talked about some missing components that don't exist on mini splits that do exist on VRV systems. So I'm going to point those out in today's video, and I'm really excited to share the runtime with you guys. So let's go ahead and jump in. So as we're getting ready to take a look at runtime today, you guys, I've grabbed a couple of pictures to show you. This is the time of year in the middle of the winter when we typically experience a lot of different problems. And as you can see from the picture here, this particular unit is really struggling to operate. Now, there's a few different things that could cause this amount of ice buildup on the coil of your outdoor unit, but generally, it's one particular issue. If you know what that particular issue is, put it in the comments below, and towards the end of the video, I'll let you know what the answer is, and we can see if you're right. There are a few different answers, but there is generally one thing that causes this level of a problem. Now, on a second note, this time of year, we have a lot of defrost issues, or so we think. When your unit is completely defrosted, you should have a nice clean heat exchanger like this picture. This is the back of the unit that I have at my house. Nice and clean, fresh off of a defrost cycle. What it should look like right before or right when it's starting the defrost cycle is a nice thin blanket of frost. So you can see here right at the top of the unit, it just started frosting out. I had just started the defrost cycle when I snapped this picture. But you can see it's a nice thin blanket of frost. This is normal. So if you're not sure if your unit is having problems with defrost, a lot of ice buildup, then compare this picture to this picture and you can clearly see the difference. All right, so now let's take a look at the runtime. So in the last video, we talked about runtime with mini splits, both single zone and multi-zone systems. And in that video, I went into great detail about how to look at Dchecker data and what the 5 tabs at the top of your Dchecker data would indicate. In today's video, I'm just going to quickly refresh what each of those mean, so that way we can jump right into the data collection. So the basic data tab is, as we discussed in the last video, a tab I don't generally use because all of the data points, there's only 4 or 5 data points that even populate in that tab. They're all located within the control, the sensor, and the actuator tabs. So there's really no reason to go back to the basic data tab at all, in my opinion. So when you look at the control tab is going to be your system control, your target values, your target condensing temperature, your target evaporating temperature. It's also going to show you what mode you're in, heating or cooling, and then whether or not your system is currently going through defrost. In addition, the control tab also has all of your safeties. We call those protections. So if your unit is currently limiting its operation due to high pressure protection or low pressure protection, it would indicate this in the control tab. Now in the sensor tab, this tab's going to have all of our pressure transducer and thermistor data from the outdoor unit. In last week's video, we did not have any pressure transducers installed, and therefore we did not have this information available to us. When you go to a VRV system, though, there are going to be many more components built into the equipment that are not installed in mini splits. So the sensor data is all of your thermistors and pressures. Then your actuator tab is going to have your outdoor unit position related items. So compressor speed, fan speed, your 4-way valve position, your expansion valve position, these types of things. So both sensor and actuator tabs are going to be at your outdoor unit. And then your indoor tab is going to have all of the indoor unit information for all of the indoor units that you have on your system. If you have one indoor unit on your VRV system, you're going to have one indoor unit shown here, and up to 8 indoor units can be shown here because that is the maximum number of indoor units you can install, unless you have a 5-ton, in which case you can have up to 9. And in that case, what you would have, you can see here, I only have 3 on my house, but if you did have more than 3, you would just simply scroll over through all of your indoor units. So very easy to navigate. And then from there, you would just click on the different tabs at the top to navigate from tab to tab. Okay, so let's take a look at our first loop. Now, as we discussed in the last video, the method that I typically use is always start with the compressor. The compressor discharge pipe temperature is always the hottest point in the system, or it should be anyways. And we like to look at what our discharge superheat is right off the compressor, which gives us a baseline for how the compressor is running. And what we'll do here is we'll take our inverter discharge pipe temperature, subtract the condensing temperature, and that difference is our discharge superheat. Now, that value, depending on the load, depending on the conditions, should be anywhere from 30 to 80 degrees. In this particular case at my house, my discharge temperature was 158 degrees. My condensing temperature, indicated by the line item that says high pressure T temperature, was 111 degrees. And so my discharge superheat was approximately 47 degrees. So I was, not exactly in the middle, but I was in between 30 and 80, which is good. The next thing that I do is I follow the refrigerant flow depending on what mode I'm in. And so we discussed this in the mini split video as well, but where is the refrigerant going when I'm in the heat mode after it leaves the compressor? Well, the next component in the system is the 4-way valve. The 4-way valve is going to be located in the Actuator tab. So if we look at the Actuator tab, you can see that the 4-way valve position says on. On means energized. In a Daikin mini split or VRV system, all of our 4-way valves energize in the heat mode. If you're in cooling, they de-energize, and therefore when you kill power or lose power, they will always fail to cooling. Which, by the way, speaking of killing power or losing power, you never want to shut the unit off with the disconnect while it's running. It's very bad for the equipment, so always make sure you turn your thermostats off, wait for the compressor to shut down, and then remove power from the system. Okay, so with the 4-way valve energized, the next location that our refrigerant should be traveling to from the 4-way valve is directly to the indoor unit. Now, what I like to do is verify my 4-way valve is doing its job. Make sure that there is no bleeding through the 4-way valve into the suction line or through my outdoor unit heat exchanger. And you can do this if you go back to the sensor tab by quickly looking at your heat exchanger temperature. In this case, it's called the de-icer temperature. That is the liquid temperature traveling into the heat exchanger from the liquid pipe. And then you can also look at your suction temperature. You can see that our suction temperature and our de-icer temperature are both very cold. Therefore, we can infer that there is no hot gas that is leaking through the 4-way valve to either of these components. So we can go to our indoor unit next because that is where the refrigerant will be traveling to next. Now, we're going to push pause just for a minute because the indoor units on VRV equipment are designed much differently than a mini split. On a mini split, I don't have an expansion valve, but you can clearly see here EV pulses. Every indoor unit on a VRV system has its own electronic expansion valve. This allows for several advantages. One of the advantages that we can talk about today is better refrigerant management, better refrigerant control. Ultimately, this gives you better comfort and higher levels of efficiency when compared to mini split or mini split multi-zone systems. You're also going to see that there is both a gas and liquid temperature sensor. And this is very advantageous for refrigerant temperature control compared to the mini splits. Mini splits only have one thermistor at the heat exchanger. We can actually look at the gas temperature coming from the outdoor unit, coming into the indoor unit heat exchanger, and the liquid temperature that's leaving the indoor unit heat exchanger. This gives us all kinds of control. So when we look at our 3 indoor units, unit number 3, unit number 2, unit number 1. Unit number 3 and unit number 1, those are my 2-ton units. One of them is my gas furnace. One of them is my air handler. We don't know just by looking at this information which one is which though. Really, the only way to know which one is which is by going in and turning one off or giving one of your units a different set point than the other so that you can distinguish which one is which when you have 2 units or more of the same size. The unit number 2 you can see is the 12. If we look at IDU capacity, that is my wall mount in the garage. So that one's an easy one. I know that's my wall mount. Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about these units and all of these data points, because this is all new, this is not something we had available to us with the mini split video. So I wanted to take a little bit more time and just show you guys the additional components here. We can continue through our refrigerant loop. So we have this hot gas. What was that temperature? Let's go back to our sensor tab and take a look at that temperature real quick. That was 158 degrees coming off of our compressor. And by the time we get to our indoor units, we have 149 degrees, 125 degrees, and 151 degrees. Your 2 2-ton units, unit number 3 and unit number 1, that show 150 degrees approximately, that entering gas temperature. Those units are fairly close to the outdoor unit. And that's why we don't see a lot of temperature change from the discharge of the compressor to our inlets of those coils. The wall mount, on the other hand, is a good distance away, a little over 100 feet, in fact. And so it is going to have a little bit more of a temperature drop by the time that hot gas gets to the indoor unit. Now, I'm only 9 to 10 minutes into the heat cycle here while I'm recording data. If I was to wait another 10 minutes, those gas temperatures are going to continue to climb. But what we're going to look at each indoor unit is 2 things. We're going to look at the liquid temperature to calculate the amount of subcooling which is occurring at each indoor unit independently. And we're also going to look at the electronic expansion valve position. So first, let's start with the liquid temperature. So the liquid temperature on each of these units, 82, 85, and 91 degrees respectively. And if we compare that to the condensing temperature, 112 degree condensing temperature, that number is going to come into play here because it's that number, 112 degrees minus the indoor unit liquid temperature, which is going to give us the amount of subcooling we have at that zone. Now, generally, we would like to have 10 degrees of subcooling at each indoor unit, but that number can vary anywhere from 5 all the way up to approximately 27 degrees. And that doesn't mean that if you have a 27 degree subcooling number, that's good. It just means that it isn't cause for alarm. Usually anything between 10 and 15, is more ideal. Now, this number is always changing because your electronic expansion valve position is always changing to try to control the amount of subcooling which is occurring at the indoor unit. So if we look at the expansion valve here, we can see that we have unit number 3's expansion valve at 357 pulses. Unit number 2 is at 630. Unit number 1 is at 704. And that is only at this particular snapshot. Again, this value will literally change every 10 seconds. And we will only see it update on our Dchecker data every minute or so. Usually it's a couple minutes at a time before a screenshot will update for your indoor units. So if I have 112 degree condensing temperature, you can see that unit number 3 has a rough subcooling, 30 degrees. That isn't really a good amount of subcooling. Again, this is just a snapshot. So what I anticipate happening over the next few minutes is that EV position is going to open up. When the EV opens up, it brings down our subcooling. If our subcooling was too low, we weren't getting enough, then that EEV is going to throttle down to increase the amount of subcooling that we have. So think of your expansion valve as your metering device, which is regulating the amount of refrigerant flowing through the indoor unit. And by adjusting the amount of volume going through the indoor unit, you're adjusting the amount of temperature exchange, which then in turn is going to be calculated into how much subcooling you have. There's more going on behind the scenes than just this, but that's kind of the basic way of understanding it. Your expansion valve is also making sure that you don't overshoot your set point. So a bunch of different things controlling superheat and subcooling, depending on what mode you're in, but also controlling the volume of refrigerant going through your indoor unit. And then, of course, as you get closer and closer to the set point, regardless of the amount of subcooling you have, that EEV is going to throttle down because we don't want to overshoot our set points. So as we're running our calculations, you see unit 3 has a near 30-degree of subcooling, which is at the high end of our range. If you look at unit number 2 is also high. Unit number 1, 91-degree liquid temperatures. It's still high, but it's closer to 20, which, isn't as bad. But look at our set points versus room temps. RC set point 71.6 degrees versus room air temperature of 70.7. So we're very close to our set point here on unit number 3. Unit number 1 is in my garage. My garage is cold. It's definitely calling for a little bit more. So I'd like to see unit number 2 start to perform a little bit better. Again, we're only 9 to 10 minutes into this recording at the time of the snapshot. So over the next 10 minutes, that gas temperature is going to come up. Our liquid temperatures are also going to come up. And that's what I would expect to see over the next several minutes. And then if we look at unit number 1, we have a 71.6 degree set point and a 70-degree room temperature. So again, we're approaching that set point. I expect in the next couple of snapshots, the expansion valve position on unit number 1 to start closing down. Because as we get closer and closer to set point, we don't want to overshoot. We want to get as close to the set point as possible without overshooting as we can. So if we were to base everything on this one snapshot, keep in mind, this snapshot is going to change constantly. But if we were to base everything on this one snapshot, I would say that my system was not performing very well. I like to use data like this because this shows us, what something could be doing in one instance, but what it should be doing in most instances. I want to show you data that isn't perfect so that you can see where the room for improvement needs to be. And by doing this, the way, the reason I like to talk about this type of data is it's not horrible, but it's also not perfect. And so this gives us the opportunity to discuss where and what things should be doing in the next couple of snippets or the next couple of screenshots. And then as you sit there and keep taking your runtime, knowing what it should be doing allows you to then watch it and make sure it responds accordingly. Regardless of the amount of subcooling I have at this particular snapshot, I have 82, 85, and 91 degrees leaving my indoor units. And collectively, they're all going to mix by the time they get back to the outdoor unit because VRV systems have one line set that branch out to all the indoor units on the circuit. It's not individual line sets. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to my outdoor unit. Now, when I go back to my outdoor unit, I'm going to go through my outdoor unit electronic expansion valve. And so I'm going to go back to my actuator tab, and you can see my outdoor unit expansion valve is at 309 pulses. For reference, your outdoor unit expansion valve has up to 480 positions. And I didn't mention this a minute ago, but your indoor unit expansion valves, you'll see here 357, 630, and 704, they can go up to 2,000 positions. So you can see here, we're nowhere near that high-end mark. If your indoor unit expansion valve is ever at 2,000 pulses, by the way, that's usually a red flag. Why is it at 2,000? I like to really hone in on an indoor unit that's at 2,000 pulses and watch it carefully to make sure that if it does hit 2,000, it comes down very quickly. It doesn't sit at 2,000 for very long because that typically indicates it's starving for refrigerant. It needs more refrigerant. Maybe there's a restriction in the system. Maybe you have a bad electronic expansion valve. Multiple things that could be happening from that, which we'll talk about in another video. But when I'm back to the outdoor unit, I'm looking at my outdoor unit expansion valve position. It's at 309 pulses, which is fine. That outdoor unit expansion valve position is doing two things. The first thing it's going to be doing is controlling the superheat of your system. So think of your liquid coming through this expansion valve. It's going to have a pressure drop and therefore a temperature drop before it goes into the outdoor unit heat exchanger. And we talked about this in the mini split video as well, but the goal is to get the liquid to drop 10 to 15 degrees below ambient conditions. So when I go back to my sensor data, I'm going to look at something called my de-icer temperature, which is the heat exchanger liquid pipe thermistor. Where you see R7T liquid pipe temperature, that's the actual liquid pipe temperature before it hits the electronic expansion valve. So on the field side at the outdoor unit, that's the combined liquid temperature of everything coming back to the outdoor unit. And then after it goes through the expansion valve, the de-icer temperature is the temperature of the liquid going into the heat exchanger. If you see the outdoor temperature at 39.7 degrees here, and you look at your de-icer temperature at 25.9, we're right around a 14 degree drop from ambient down to that de-icer temperature. So we're right at the maximum range of how far we would want it to be. If it was dropping too far, then that outdoor expansion valve could start to open up. The outdoor expansion valve is also going to be controlling volume of refrigerant. See, we also have to manage the discharge pipe temperature. If you throttle down your outdoor expansion valve too much, then you have less refrigerant flowing through your outdoor heat exchanger, and therefore your compressor's discharge pipe temperature is going to go up. So we're balancing the pressures on both the high and the low side to make sure everything can hit targets. Those EEVs then regulating to make sure we're maintaining subcooling at the indoors, superheat at the outdoor unit, so that everybody plays nicely. And so here we can see that we're going to go through the outdoor heat exchanger. Our suction temperatures, they're ultimately coming back to the compressor. There are two of them on this particular system because there's one before and one after the accumulator. They're both about 24 degrees. And then that low pressure gas is going to go back to the compressor. Now, this is not the best data that I grabbed a screenshot of at my outdoor unit. I would have liked to see my suction temperature be a little bit warmer, especially, considering we're not operating that hard. So again, we're only 9 minutes into the recording. I always recommend when guys are hooking up Dchecker that you run the system for 20 minutes before you analyze any of your data. Because if you're let's say you're starting from an off position, right? So you turn the system off, you plug in your Dchecker, then you power the system back on. That was something we discussed in the how to connect your Dchecker video. So you're starting from an off position. That unit's going to have a ton of liquid sitting in the heat exchanger, and it's going to take some time to process that loop. It's gonna have bad data for a few minutes before it really starts meeting its targets and having good superheat and subcool values. But again, I don't like just showing you good data because we need to be able to recognize when there's a point that isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. So once we get back to the compressor, then what I would do from there is make my loop again. And then after I get through my next loop, I would make my loop again and again and again. And I basically just keep doing this for the entirety of my recording. And sometimes I'll record for 1 hour. Sometimes I'll be at a job and I'll record for the entire day. I was at a job recently where the system was actually overcharged. The compressor was never ramping. And by the end of the day, it turns out it was about 2.5 pounds overcharged. And on these small systems that only have, 7 pounds in them to begin with, or 8 pounds or 9 pounds, and on the mini splits, it's even less, 3 pounds in some cases, it only takes a few ounces up or under, over or undercharged to affect how these systems operate. So you do have to very carefully measure the line sets when you're installing the system. Otherwise, your system is not going to perform properly. And in that particular case, I took runtime all day long because as we slowly dialed in the refrigerant charge, it takes time. And that is the most important thing that I could probably stress to you guys when you're looking at runtime data is you have to be patient. And I'm the most impatient person. So, it's very hard. I totally understand. But you have to be patient. You have to let the system have time to adjust and come to its targets and give it time to react because you can't add or remove and then immediately see the difference. It's going to take a few minutes. All right, you guys, that's about it for today. I know once again, it's a lot of information to get through and technical. So I appreciate you guys sticking with me through the end. My goal for this video series, the Dchecker series, was really just get you guys some information on, the mini split and VRV systems, refrigerant circuits, and get you comfortable with the Dchecker and at least give you guys a little bit of an overview on the refrigeration loop and how to reference the components and what the refrigerant should be doing with the data points on the Dchecker. There's still, so much to talk about within these systems today. And last week's video was really just an overview to kind of get you guys started. And of course, we only talked about the heat mode because it is the middle of winter right now when we're recording these videos. So this spring or this summer, if you guys are interested in seeing more in the cooling mode, we can absolutely do a couple of videos on the mini split, single multi-zone systems, and the VRV systems in cooling mode if that's what you guys would like to see. As far as the picture from earlier goes, the outdoor unit that was totally kicked in ice, if you guys said it was low on charge, you are correct. That is one of the more common causes for that particular situation to occur. Of course, there's other factors that could cause that, but most of the time it's a unit that's low on charge. So if that's what you put in the comments below, congratulations, you guys. I'm looking forward to seeing what else you guys said in the comments though, because again, like I said, there are other answers, other causes for that type of thing to happen. If you guys have any other questions, if you have any other comments or ideas for future videos, please leave them in the comments below. I do read all of your comments and I try to reply to as many of them as possible. If you guys enjoyed today's video, please click that like button below. It really helps out my channel. Now that I've hit 100 subscribers, you guys, my goal is let's get to 1,000. That is a big growth goal for me. And I'd like to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So we still have a few months to get there, but help me out by subscribing if you haven't already. I really appreciate it, you guys. Thank you so much for watching Inverter Always. I hope you all have an awesome day.